Jane Austen famously said of Emma Woodhouse that she would write a heroine whom no one but herself would much like. Now, Jane was clearly exercising her trademark irony with a statement like that, because over 2 centuries since the publication of Emma, her 4th published novel, this Austen heroine has been seen by many, myself included, as one of the most complex and, dare I say, even relatable of her characters. And that's quite a feat, considering the fact that Austen gifted us a vibrant panoply, an astonishing heterocosm of compelling protagonists who feel like real people, all with their own distinct and unique voices. Jane Austen is very much like Shakespeare and Dickens in that regard, and the fact that she managed to create so many iconic characters across the course of just 6 novels is absolutely astonishing. Now, don't get me wrong, there absolutely are scores of readers who detest Emma Woodhouse. Indeed, very recently I told members of the Hardcore Literature Book Club that I had tragically dropped one of my lecture copies of Emma in a river. Foolish me for thinking that I could take Austen outside and enjoy her work in the autumnal season. But the common sentiment, a really common sentiment that I heard back when I said that, was many readers saying, I would like to throw my copy of Emma in a river too. So absolutely there are many readers who detest Emma Woodhouse, and truly you're supposed to. It's by design. You're supposed to dislike her, at least for the first 2/3 of the novel. I mean, let's just check out the irony that is so heavy in that iconic opening line. Let's read it together. Emma Woodhouse, handsome, clever, and rich, with a comfortable home and happy disposition, seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence, and had lived nearly 21 years in the world with very little to distress or vex her. The power of Austen is lost if you take anything at face value. You can appreciate her genius only when you read every single line as though it were written with a wink and in a wry, sarcastic tone. Oh, Emma is clever, but perhaps not as clever as she thinks she is. This young woman, who fancies herself to be an expert matchmaker, who has the power to orchestrate and coordinate the romantic lives of everyone around her, actually has rather a lot to learn about herself and the world and life. She has a lot to learn. Readers coming to the story for the very first time, expecting to meet a bubbly, lively and charming heroine like Elizabeth Bennett from Pride and Prejudice, or expecting to meet a quiet, mature, resolute and sensitive thinker like Anne Elliot from Persuasion, might be disgruntled by the fact that the heroine we're following across the course of this story is immature, prideful, arrogant, confidently incorrect on many things. She's disagreeable for the sake of being disagreeable. She's snobbish, and quite honestly, she is a spoiled brat who needs to learn to grow up. But to call Emma a heroine who no one but herself would like has to be ironic, and it has to be hyperbolic, because indeed this novel was a bestseller during its day and it was seriously popular. Yes, it divided critics. Many loved it, but many said that there's no story, in fact, no story except that of this spoiled brat. And this division, this split between the readership continues right up to our time. It continues today. And yet, what you will see whenever there's a discussion around Jane Austen's Emma, you will find that there are plenty of readers who passionately leap to the defence of Emma Woodhouse, who find a character who has her flaws, as we all do, but who is also caring, loyal, warm-hearted, well-intentioned, funny, who has great powers of imagination, and most importantly, is receptive to self-growth. And across the course of this spoiler-free introduction to the work, I myself am hoping to launch a preemptive defence of Emma too, because I hold her very dear, and I find watching her personal growth over the course of the novel as the story unfolds to be not only ferociously funny, but also incredibly relatable and endlessly personally instructive. My personal favourite Jane Austen novel always changes with the seasons. It changes depending on what I'm going through in my life at time of reading, but Emma, no matter what, is always competing for top spot, and I want my love for this work to be your love too. Jane Austen, without a doubt, is one of the greatest writers of all time. She absolutely revolutionised the novel form, and she changed the face of imaginative literature forever, with her narrative innovations, her prose style, and her iconic and unforgettable, psychologically complex characters. And one of the many things that I love about Austen is the fact that she is able to say so much in such a compressed space. There is not a slack or loose word. Every line in her works is bursting with subtle irony, sophisticated satire, and the kind of vitality that comes from seeing the comic absurdity of everyday life. And in short, if you want to learn to better abide the human condition, then go to Jane Austen. I've certainly found her novels to be life-changing and life-saving, so this discussion is going to serve as a Georgian springboard, a Regency romance launching pad for our read-through of Jane Austen's Emma at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. We're just now kicking off a reading of this masterpiece. Across the autumnal period, we're going to read Jane Austen, and then across the festive period, we're going to dig into a masterpiece from Mr. Charles Dickens. As you may know, if you're reading with the book club, we love to round off the year, every year, with a Charles Dickens novel, as we congratulate ourselves for a great reading year and prepare for another great reading year to come. And I would like to let you know that at time of recording, at the end of this month, I will be I'll be unveiling the Hardcore Literature Book Club schedule, the reading programme, the syllabus for 2026. And it's going to be an absolutely phenomenal reading year. So if you haven't already, you might like to hit the notification bell for this YouTube channel, and you will be notified immediately when that video goes up. And of course, if you want even more bookish content, then we have almost 700 long-form literary lectures and read-throughs for the great books available to enjoy instantly on demand at patreon.com/hardcore literature. And we have a thriving, kind, thoughtful and beautiful community, a family of readers from all backgrounds, and many have said that becoming a member of the Hardcore Literature Book Club has been the single most significant thing when it comes to not only improving their reading, but also improving their sense of mental well-being. So join us on the bookish adventure of a lifetime, and having just mentioned well-being, let's dive into Jane Austen, because indeed the works of Austen, I contend, are some of the most healing in all of literature. Jane Austen, like William Shakespeare, has the power to heal not only the rift between the sexes, the rift between men and women, but she has the power to heal the rift within oneself too. And if you bring yourself to Austen consistently over the long term, you will benefit from great intellectual and emotional growth. And indeed, for a work to be wisdom literature, which I take Austen's novels to be, they must engage both the head and the heart, and her novels absolutely do that. Now, ardent admirers of Jane's works already know this from personal experience, from rereading her works constantly. They already know that her stories nourish them. But did you know there have actually been neuroscientific studies to back this assertion up? Indeed, MRI scans taken whilst readers were absorbed in a great Jane Austen novel, specifically a Jane Austen novel. They did a study with Mansfield Park, in fact, showed an increased blood flow to the parts of the brain responsible for coordinating complex cognitive functions. We're talking about adaptable thinking, working memory, self-control and organisation, and that suggests masterpieces from Jane Austen to offer us not only a great escape, but a really valuable intellectual exercise when we read them too. And it's really not hard to see why, if we're putting it simply, reading Jane Austen's novels will make you smarter. You need to have really good levels of concentration to stay with her subtlety, to catch the humour, to read between the lines and observe what's not being said. You need to have great concentration to observe the multiple layers and levels of meaning that are always present. And if you do not exercise your powers of concentration, they will diminish, they will atrophy. So the best way to improve your concentration is to read great books like Emma. And indeed, you can read a novel like Emma a dozen plus times and you will always see new things. You'll see things you missed the first time or second or third time around. This book is designed to be reread. And we'll see this together when we appreciate this book at the Hardcore Literature Book Club and when we pull apart some passages a little later in the video. But indeed, being able to appreciate subtext and irony is where intellect and empathy merge. So reading Austen's not just an intellectual exercise, it's an exercise in strengthening your powers of empathy too. Cognition and emotion are interlinked. One needs intelligence in order to interpret social signals and to hold multiple, often contrary opinions in your mind. And as you likely know, in social situations, only a very small percentage of communication is verbal, through language, expressed in language. The overwhelming majority of communication is everything that is not language, which of course poses a unique problem for the writer of social novels like Jane Austen. And the fact that she's able to say so much via what she does not say, via what is covertly suggested rather than overtly expressed, is a great demonstration of her absolute genius. Psychological studies into empathy or emotional intelligence and its link to reading rich literary fiction, like the works of Austen, have shown that these novels improve one's theory of mind, the ability to understand the thoughts and emotions of other people. And studies have shown that immersion in these narratives simulates real social experience and allows one to have a flight simulator of sorts for the real world, for your social life. And indeed, being in the company of a heroine who is as flawed and at times rather unlikable as Emma, that is lifelike. That is like life itself. And the uncomfortable thing for many readers when it comes to Emma is in seeing rather too much of one's younger self. We see the behaviour of Emma Woodhouse and perhaps we wince from embarrassment about how we used to be. And if we take a character like Lizzie Bennett from Pride and Prejudice, she is filled with pride and she has her prejudices, just like Emma, and yet we find her to be charming and endearing. And for women readers, perhaps Lizzie is the model for the kind of woman we wish to be or wish to be like. And for male readers, Lizzie could well be the model for the woman we would like to be with, the heroine we would very much like to meet. But when it comes to Emma Woodhouse, she is much more realistic because Emma is like the woman we have already been, or perhaps already are in some way. And for male readers, Emma is more like the woman we might actually meet and be with and fall in love with. But Jane Austen gives us a real gift with her stories, filled with social misunderstanding, moral judgments, and necessary emotional growth. We get to partake in all of this and therefore accelerate our own deep development. We get to live more lives in one via great works like this. And I've long thought that one of the main values of great literature, like that penned by Austen, Shakespeare or Dickens, is the fact that we get to see ourselves. We get these sublime Rorschach tests. We get these mirrors held up to ourselves. But as I grow older, I find that the real blessing of great literature is not so much to see ourselves, but to spend time in the company of others. And as Michel de Montaigne would say, he knows himself so well because he knows others, and vice versa. The blessing of great literature is we get to be in company whilst in solitude. We get to live as another and make their mistakes and learn from them whilst having enormous fun. And at the end of the day, all social and moral benefits aside, because I do not think Jane wrote primarily to improve society, all of that aside, the novels of Jane Austen are, simply put, hilarious stories that offer us fun escapism. These books are portable time machines. And this is why Jane Austen was the primary novelist used in the rise of bibliotherapy during the World Wars. Bibliotherapy, as a clinical practice, arose significantly during the First World War, when doctors and psychologists discovered that men suffering from severe trauma in the wake of shell and gas attacks, having seen their friends blown apart and having themselves lost limbs or nearly lost their own lives, they discovered that stocking the hospitals with a library of certain kinds of fiction, we're talking poetry and novels, significantly relieved emotional distress and helped men to cope with what we now understand to be PTSD. And the author, whose novels wartime soldiers suffering in the trenches continuously returned to and reread, seeking comfort, was Jane Austen. The Army Medical Corps actually overtly advised shell-shocked soldiers to read Austen, and indeed the term Janeite, which means a lover of Jane Austen's works. If you love Shakespeare, you're a bardolater. If you love Jane Austen, you are a Janeite. That term was first coined in 1894 by scholar George Saintsbury in his Introduction to Pride and Prejudice, and was made more popular thanks to a short story by Rudyard Kipling, which he wrote having lost his son in World War I. And he found that sharing the works of Austen with his wife, reading them aloud, and sharing Austen's works with his friends helped to comfort him, helped to somewhat soothe the immense grief. And he wrote a story, which I encourage you to check out, called The Janeites, which is about a group of intelligent soldiers in the trenches, some of them very seriously wounded, and how they formed a secret society of readers of Austen specifically, and they could connect with one another and find comfort via the discussion around these novels. This is what great literature gives us. It gives us a pretense to talk about really, really important things. Why do I put how to reads together? How to read this book or how to read that book? Because reading isn't just pragmatic, it's not just mechanical, it's not just a matter of scanning your eyes across the page. Very often there are tools, mental tools and knowledge that you need to equip yourself with to greatly appreciate the work before you. There's socio-historical context, there's learning about the rise of the novel form or the rise of poetry, the rise of the epic, learning about the tradition, learning about how the writer's life exerted an influence on their work, and indeed vice versa. All of this is very valuable. If you wanted to appreciate a Caravaggio painting, you wouldn't just look at it. Of course you need to look at it, but you'd want to learn about brushstrokes and the interplay of light and dark and the religious thematics, the symbolism and the rise of that. And the same is true when it comes to difficult music that has a barrier to entry, we might say, like classical music and jazz. You want to learn about scales and you want to learn about the development of it over time. Why? Because whilst we're doing all of this, we're connecting, we're talking about things that concern us, we're talking about the human condition, and we're learning from one another. So I just love these books. It's the same with scripture. The reason that scripture is so great is because it can bring people together as they interpret, as they bring their interpretation together. There's a collaborative sense of play with this sort of thing. But anyway, Rudyard Kipling's short story was about these soldiers forming their Jane Austen society. They even named their guns after certain characters, Mr Collins and Lady de Bourgh from Pride and Prejudice specifically. And the main character in this story finds himself connecting with a wartime nurse when he finds out that she is a secret Janeite, when she quotes a line from Emma. In the story, we get this wonderful quote: "There's no one to touch, Jane, when you're in a tight place." I wholeheartedly agree. And indeed, it wasn't just the men in the trenches who were reading Jane to survive. The wartime Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, also found solace in her books when he was bedridden with pneumonia during the Second World War, and he had Pride and Prejudice read aloud to him. Reflecting on the characters of this great novel, which, by the way, we have a lecture series for in the back catalogue of the Hardcore Literature Book Club, Churchill would say, "What calm lives they had, those people. No worries about the French Revolution or the crashing struggle of the Napoleonic Wars. Only manners, controlling natural passion as far as they could, together with cultured explanations of any mischances." Now, it might seem strange today to imagine martial men reading Austen's courtship novels, delighting in her Regency romances and delighting in the gossip of who proposed to who and who was amiable and who was not. But it's very interesting to note that Jane Austen's reputation as a writer of primarily women's literature is actually a relatively recent development, historically speaking. During the 19th century and the very early 20th century, as well as being adored by countless women readers who found escape and relatability in her works, Jane Austen's novels were also positively worshipped in refined men's clubs around the country, and reading Jane Austen was once seen as a mark not only of fine aesthetic taste and intelligence, but masculine elegance too. Men fell in love with Austen's heroines the same way that women would dream of finding their Mr Knightley or Mr Darcy or Captain Wentworth. Male readers would fantasise about falling in love with an Emma, a Lizzie or an Anne Elliot, and they would fantasise about experiencing their own versions of these love stories, finding a partner who was on equal intellectual footing with them and who was ultimately their dear friend. Because that's what we find in Austen. Everyone ultimately gets their perfect match and the romantic partners are ultimately good friends. And one reason why I think both women and men alike adored Jane Austen's novels is because she did not speak down to anyone, nor did she position herself as writing for only one specific section of society. Shakespeare was one of the few male writers who could craft compelling women characters who were all their own individual, autonomous people with their own capacious consciousnesses. Now, to be fair, many male writers couldn't do that with male characters either, but in the same way that Shakespeare could do that, Jane Austen did much the same thing for her men characters. It's very often the case that writers struggle to get the consciousness of the other sex right in their fiction. You read books by men and very often the women characters are just there to complement the men. They are the woman of the narrative rather than an individual in her own right. But women writers do this too, except Jane Austen absolutely does not. She does not write men and women. She writes unique humans, unique personages. Austen gave us odious men, but she gave us unlikable women too. And she gave us heroines we could root for, and male leads we could root for. Man or woman, the flaws she explored were always human. And yes, she made relentless commentary on the war between the sexes, the merry war we might say. But she managed to stay in the no man's land between the two camps, lambasting her own team, if you like, and often giving credit to the other side. Or indeed, simply showing both of them to be utterly ridiculous regardless of who they were, man or woman. She's read today, understandably, as a novelist that gave voice to the need for women's independence, but she did that by taking a comprehensive view of society in which she and her readers were able to see every possible angle with great humour. That's why her pioneering narrative technique of free indirect discourse was so revolutionary, because she could be both omniscient, she could be God in her universe, and she could also zoom in and out of the interiority of individuals. She could inhabit each of her characters' minds, and this is very rewarding to read, because indeed in real life we wish we could do that, don't we? We're very often, if not always, confined to our very own narrow point of view. Fiction liberates us from that. So Jane Austen has the reputation of being a women's writer, a woman writing for women, and she absolutely is that, because she speaks right to the heart of the concerns of women. She talks about the pragmatics of loveless marriages. She talks about the imbalances in societal power between the sexes, and she explores how a woman might live within a world that she doesn't quite fit into. And indeed, a BBC Radio 4 Woman's Hour poll for the novel that women could most relate to resulted in a 93% vote for Pride and Prejudice, and women readers said that that novel and Austen continues to be relevant today and also makes them proud to be women. But looking to the history of the appreciation of her novels, we see that both women and men have long found great comfort in her books, because she's ultimately a universal writer. No matter what you're going through right now, pick up a novel by Jane Austen and allow yourself to go with it. Just let go and go with it and inhabit her world. Meet her characters in good faith, and you are very likely to find some relief from your troubles, from your mental woes. Not only do her characters become friends and family, because indeed you recognise your own friends and family, but Austen herself becomes a dear friend. She's frequently referred to as Jane by her readers, the same way that we might call Shakespeare Will, and many see her as a close cousin, an aunt, sometimes even an older sister. Essentially, Jane Austen is a wise, close friend and family member who is always there for us. Let's talk historical context and biography. You read these older novels, and very often you will find that you need to do quite a bit of background digging and research in order to appreciate what is contemporary political commentary. Many of our favourite books are making comment on the political situation of their time. That's true for George Eliot. That's true for the Bronte sisters. That's true for Tolstoy and Dostoevsky. And of course that's true for Charles Dickens too. And whilst it's true that you should know a little bit about the Georgian social hierarchy in order to appreciate Jane Austen's novels, and I go into that quite deeply in my Pride and Prejudice video. If you navigate over to that, and via the timestamps you can find that discussion. What's really fascinating time and again when it comes to Austen is the fact that there is a significant absence of commentary in her works about the turbulent, violent and often frightening period of time she was living through. As Churchill said, there's no sense that these people are living in the age of Napoleonic war and revolution. It doesn't come through, does it? It's the absence of that is very, very interesting. So let's get to know Jane a little bit. We might consider that a 21-year-old Jane wrote her sparkling social comedy of manners First Impressions, which would later go on to be titled Pride and Prejudice. She wrote that between 1796 and 1797. Now, it would be heavily revised and it was initially rejected, and so Pride and Prejudice ended up being published at a later date in 1813. But at the time of writing, during this really formative age, you had the French Revolution ravishing the country across the Channel. Working men and women in France, tired of the gluttony and the greed of the aristocrats of the Ancien Regime, rose up and they started guillotining them in the streets. Blood flowed and heads rolled in the streets, and indeed the beast would then feast upon itself until Napoleon seized power in a coup d'etat right before the turn of the century. And we see that Gothic literature, which we've spoken a lot about at the Hardcore Literature Book Club recently, Gothic literature exploded out of the French Revolution as writers in England were using their fiction to explore or think through the horrific bloodshed they were hearing about across the Channel. And indeed, Jane Austen, when she was young, she would devour these novels, these Gothic novels, and she would even pen a parody of them herself with Northanger Abbey. But her knowledge of the Revolution came rather more close to home than from just reading Gothic novels, because indeed, around this time, her cousin Elizabeth, or Eliza, had just fled France after her husband, who was a French aristocrat, was guillotined in the street during the Reign of Terror. She fled to England and took refuge at Steventon in Hampshire. Indeed, she would actually later end up marrying one of Jane's brothers, Henry, and the both of them together would help Jane push her books towards publication. So Jane was hearing some absolutely god-awful true stories about terror, about bloodshed and violence first hand, right in the heart of Hampshire. And around this time, she was living in the Rectory. That was where she was born, with her mother and her clergyman father, and with 6 brothers and her older sister, her beloved Cassandra. And it's in this environment that she would write Pride and Prejudice, Northanger Abbey, and Sense and Sensibility. Now, when you read Emma, you might find it useful to retain the knowledge that Jane Austen grew up with many brothers, with older brothers. I think you can tell that she was endlessly and lovingly ribbed by them. She was a sensitive thinker and a voracious reader, but she very quickly developed a knowledge of the male sex and a keen satirical ability that bordered on the vicious. And indeed, if you think that the social satire of her novels is sharp, you might consider that her sister Cassandra would burn most of her personal correspondence upon Jane's death, because indeed, a lot of what she said in her personal correspondence was more than sharp, much sharper than we get in her novels. She actually feared that Jane's honesty and biting powers of critique could cause quite the posthumous offence. But anyway, Jane Austen grew up in a full household, and they did not have a lot of money. They did not own their house. It was given to her father as a clergyman. They were essentially renting it. They didn't own that, and with 9 dependents, of course, there wasn't much money left over on a clergyman's salary. In fact, there was basically nothing. But what she did get from her father was enormous emotional support. She was fortunate that her father was very, very encouraging and loving when it came to her writing. They weren't personally wealthy by any means, but they were lucky that the Rectory had a library of 500 volumes with all the great writers, Shakespeare, Milton, and so on. And she would read with her dad. She would read these great books, and she would also pen her own stories and read them aloud to him and the family, and they would laugh, and he encouraged her to take Pride and Prejudice to the publishers, and he encouraged her by buying her first writing desk. So I think we can see why Austen does not take a position when it comes to the war between the sexes, because she knew and she loved men. She had a lot of positive experience with her male family members. You don't want to draw one-to-one parallels when it comes to characters and real people, but I definitely think that Jane and her father George had a relationship that was much more like Lizzie and Mr Bennett than that of Emma and Mr Woodhouse. What's interesting when it comes to Jane's life and aesthetic output is you can draw a line right down the middle of her career, down the middle of her novels, depending on where she was living at the time. Her earlier novels, by composition, not publication, have a real youthful vigour to them. They have the lively energy and vivacious naivety of intelligent youth. So there's a little bit of naivety and hopefulness and optimism and youthful energy, but also there's young maturity, if you know what I mean. And these earlier novels have a sparkling energy to them. If reading Charles Dickens is like drinking mulled wine by the fire, reading the early novels of Jane Austen is like quaffing a glass or two of Prosecco. But when she reached the age of 25, Jane's father retired and they moved to the spa city of Bath, which she wasn't happy about. A few years later, her father would die, leaving Jane, Cassandra and their mother in a very tough financial situation, with very little, basically nothing in the way of money, no permanent home and a feeling of great uncertainty. And this led to writer's block. This led to a great creative dearth in which Jane wasn't writing. Several years on from that, Jane would luckily move to Chawton when her brother Edward, who had become wealthy via inheritance, he had been adopted by the Knight family, the wealthy Knight family, and so his name was Knight, Edward Knight. We might think it is no coincidence that the male lead in Emma is called Knightley. Her brother offered her sister and his mother a cottage on his estate in Hampshire, and from here not only would Jane revise her earlier works, but she wrote new novels marked by the maturity of experience. I think Austen would have agreed with Virginia Woolf's assertion that a woman needs money in a room of her own in order to write. But the new novels, the older novels, the more mature novels that came out of Chawton were Mansfield Park, Emma and Persuasion. So, the same way that you can run a line right down the centre of Dickens, pre and post David Copperfield, and you can do the same for Shakespeare too, pre and post Hamlet, you can do that with Jane Austen. Now, these later novels bear all the marks of her tragically deteriorating health. She was in very poor health as she got older, but they're also so psychologically complex in a way that people hadn't seen before in the novel, and that psychological complexity clearly speaks to her having had a life of challenges, social, financial, romantic, emotional, challenges aplenty. And another commonality between Austen and Shakespeare is the fact that the split can be marked out by death in the family. How does Shakespeare produce Hamlet? Well, sadly he experienced the death of his son, and also the death of his father, and all the works after that are much more tragic. They're much more bleak. And the death that changed the course of Austen's life and career was that of her father, George Austen. That absolutely and utterly destroyed her. And so perhaps the male lead of Emma was named not only in honour of her brother, Knightley, but perhaps he was also named in honour of her father. His first name's George. What's really interesting with these later novels as well is we really significantly see that Austen, like all the great writers, went from being influenced by other writers to being an influence upon herself. And this is one of the great mysteries at the heart of great literature. How does a mind influence itself? And Emma is a really unique book because it has a blend of the early and late Austen. You can tell that she was revising her earlier works around this time. So we've got some of the sparkling wit and funny repartee, but we've also got the psychological complexity too. And it's worth considering as well, although this does not make a huge feature in her books, that not only had she undergone a lot over the course of her life, but Europe had been going through a lot from the time of her first penning Pride and Prejudice in her early 20s to writing Emma at the age of 39. That's quite a gulf. 21 versus 39. We're talking about almost 2 decades here. She began writing Emma in 1814 and it was finished and published in 1815. Now, England under Prime Minister Pitt was basically at continuous war over the course of much of Austen's life. Along with the allied forces of Prussia, Holland and Belgium, England was at war with France under Napoleon. And the country was in near constant fear of a land invasion. A land invasion, but people were also scared of revolutionary fervour. There was this feeling that, well, we don't want what's happened over there to come over here. And this resulted in Britain expanding its homeland defence force to 300,000 men, and Austen's brother Henry would serve. He was one of those men. And it was in the year of writing Emma that Napoleon abdicated after serious defeat. Now, if you want to know all about this period of history in depth, then check out our lecture series for War and Peace, A Tale of Two Cities, The Count of Monte Cristo, and also Les Miserables in the back catalogue of the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature. So Napoleon finally abdicated and he was exiled to Elba. And peace finally followed and there was a shift in power back to the monarchical until Napoleon left Elba and marched his way back to Paris, accruing men who supported him along the way, and he took power again for 100 days, until his defeat at Waterloo, in which he was exiled to a much farther off locale. He was sent to St Helena, upon which he would die. And what followed finally around this time, for the first time in many people's lifetime, was peace between England and France. Oh, that must have been nice. And so, remarkably, aside from a brief mention here and there of militia, the home force, and they're not painted in a particularly good light when they crop up in Austen's novels, they're kind of ne'er-do-wells, and we learn that the character of Jane Fairfax in Emma, her father was killed during the Napoleonic Wars. Aside from very brief mentions, there's virtually nothing overt about this seismic cultural and political context in her novels. In Austen's novels, what do the characters talk of? Do they talk of war? Do they talk of this uncertainty? No, they talk about who's marrying who. Which bachelor of the parish is the most amiable? And amiable means attractive and a good romantic prospect, and that typically means you have a bunch of money. And what do we find in these novels? We find that small town petty gossip is blown up to the most centre stage drama, which I find is relatable. And what we find, remarkably, in Austen's novels is realism. Now, we've spoken about realism a lot at the book club. We've spoken about the difference between romance and realism. We spoke about this significantly during our lecture series for Flaubert and Alexandre Dumas this year, and we went all the way back to Homer's Odyssey and saw how romance developed across time. We get a new kind of novel with Jane Austen. We get social realism and we get characters who we feel we've met before. And her characters are not quite types, they're unique. In fact, you might call many of her peripheral characters rounded types, because there is a defining element to them, but they're also very much real people. Now, Sir Walter Scott, who, by the way, I'm binging through at the moment, and I am loving his oeuvre. I recently treated myself to an early 19th century complete collection of his works. You can see them behind me. At the moment, I'm reading Guy Mannering. I'm just about to finish that one off. Sir Walter Scott picked up on this when he reviewed Emma. He noted that novels, which were still a new form of writing, like those of Henry Fielding and Fanny Burney, often had a lot of unrealistic elements. They were stuffed with sentimentality and melodrama. Now, you might have some realism or sense of reality here and there, but of course those rare instances only punctuated the more exciting incidents. Novels were filled with sword fights and abductions and acts of heroines. That's why people went to the novel. Scott praised Austen, however, for presenting realistic characters and realistic situations that were believable within the bounds of ordinary life. This was revolutionary. And this is something that Austen learnt from Samuel Richardson, who was a pioneer when it comes to the rise of realism. And when all of the novels, all of your stories, all of the most popular works are romantic and unrealistic, of course the reading public is going to crave novelty in the form of what's ostensibly mundane, because it's relatable. So essentially, I stress the fact that the political context of the time is a huge absence in her work, and that's interesting. And we might wonder why. Well, when you feel the turbulence of being at constant war, or when you feel the constant turbulence of revolution, the thing about revolution and war is after a while, that becomes mundane. You get attuned to it, and you also get bored with having to feel scared all of the time. When you feel that on your day-to-day, do you want more of it in your fiction? Do you want your novels, which are supposed to be an escape, do you want your novels to read like a contemporary newspaper? Do you want them exactly the same? The answer for most people is no. What do you really want? Would you rather, when you're in an uncertain world, would you rather be transported away from all of that? Would you rather be given the gift of living in a merry old England, where the greatest concern of your daily life revolves around matchmaking and balls and the intricacies of courtship? We go to Austen because she gives us a perennial home to hang out in. It's home that's also a holiday. We get to holiday at home. It's recognisable, it's refreshing, but we get to just cast our worries aside for a moment. She gives us a retreat, and I, for one, love returning to Hartfield every few years for a little retreat. I read at least one Austen every single year, the same way I read one Dickens at least every single year, and I'm always reading Shakespeare, as you probably know. And truly, I am filled with so much sadness when I contemplate the fact that Jane Austen left us with such a relatively small body of published work. And Emma was the last work she wrote that would be published in her lifetime. Just a year and a half on from Emma, Austen died after worsening illness at the tragically young age of 41. And the cause of her illness is still up for speculation. We don't know. Many think it would have been cancer of some kind. But her last completed work, Persuasion, would end up being published posthumously, thanks to her brother, and that was published in the same volume as her more juvenile work, Northanger Abbey, in 1817. And I think there's something really poignant about her most mature and her most youthful piece coming together in the same volume after her death. But I absolutely despair to think about what she managed to accomplish across the course of just a 3-year period. We see that when Austen was creatively fertile, she had periods of 3 to around 4 or 5 years in which she had the power to consistently produce these unforgettable and beautifully rich stories. And the extraordinary thing about these novels, and this is something that I say a lot when it comes to Austen, is the fact that from the outside, yes, when it comes to people who know of her, but perhaps haven't read her too deeply, maybe they've watched an adaptation of one of her books or half watched it, maybe they dimly recall one of her works from school. From the outside, it looks like Austen's writing the same story over and over again. And yes, it's true, all of her novels are Regency romances. They're romances written in the Regency period, but each novel within that remit is so incredibly distinct and unique. The concerns of each of her novels are different. Now, thematically, her works do always centre around marriage and class and love, but what she does with those themes in each one is extraordinary. Her palette of expression and her nuance of thought is absolutely astonishing, and she uses her novels as her essay form. She gets to think through her thoughts in fictive form. All of her books are so different. You've got Pride and Prejudice, which is of course a romantic comedy. It's a rom-com, and it would provide the template for rom-coms that we enjoy today. Mansfield Park, on the other hand, is the anti-rom-com, if you like, and that's a sophisticated moral tale. That was her underappreciated child in her lifetime. She was very upset that more people were not reading Mansfield Park. Persuasion, on the other hand, that's really different as well. That's a contemplative, autumnal mood piece with a real elegiac quality to it. Northanger Abbey, of course, is parody, juvenile gothic parody. Not only is each novel different, and thus in Karen Joy Fowler's book, and of course the film adaptation of the Jane Austen book club, you see that each Janeite has their own Austen novel, and it means something to them. We all have our own Emma or our own Pride and Prejudice. Not only is each novel different, but each heroine is distinct too. Austen ensured that every heroine was markedly different from the one who came before her. We can say this for the central male love interest too, but it's very noticeable with the heroines. And this is why everyone's list of favourite Austen novels will be different and will be a reflection of their own soul. Same with Shakespeare, same with Dickens. And indeed, one of the most polarising novels that I've seen when it comes to Jane Austen is this one. It's Emma. Yes, you will see Emma taking the middle spot in some readers' lists, if readers have read all of Austen, which is something you should do, and you should do it over time. It won't take that long before you read all of her works. Yes, Emma appears in the middle position for some lists, but I actually see Emma is often number one or right at the bottom. It's either someone's favourite or it's someone's absolute least favourite. And when a novel can do that, when it can arouse those feelings of love and hate, and both of those are preferable to indifference when it comes to art, that's a sign that something special and sincere is taking place in the work. I say all this to lament the fact that if Jane had managed to live another decade, if her health had been restored, it's not hard to imagine her having another creative 3-year period. It's not hard to imagine at least another 3 novels, each of which would be incredibly different with markedly different heroines. To think of the unique creative offerings that we don't have that we absolutely would have hurts me. So, we've said how the turbulent political context is quite removed from Austen's fictive world, but what other absences exist as presences in her work? Well, Jane's love life, or indeed potential love life. If there's one thing that many will know about Jane Austen, it's the fact that she remained unmarried her entire life. And whilst I know that some critics have read this decision as Austen practicing what she surely believed, that marriage as an institution was akin to imprisonment for women of the day, I cannot help but feel like Jane would have very much loved to have been married. But here's the crux, and here's what she's always working through with her heroines, the heroines of her masterful novels. She would have wanted to be married to someone she loved. That's the caveat, that's the important caveat. Not just for money, not just for financial security, not just for class or social station, not just to appease one's family, not for any of the primary reasons that people typically married during her day, but she most likely would have liked to have been married for deep, true, romantic love and a bond of friendship within that love. But this was so far from the expectation when it came to marriage at the time that we could almost say, without too much exaggeration, that Jane Austen basically invented the concept of marrying for love in her novels that still endures across the Western world today. Biographers see her first love, or at least her first crush, as a charming Irishman named Tom Lefroy. This was the one who got away, we might say. Jane met Tom in the winter of 1795 to 1796 at a Christmas ball in Steventon. In a letter to her sister Cassandra, Jane describes dancing with her Irish boy a lot and flirting a lot, and she playfully talks about being shockingly profligate in how they danced and sat down together. Bear in mind, this was a world in which a man and a woman would never really be alone. Unless they were family, they would not be alone together unless the man was about to propose marriage. That would have been very improper. So how did you get your social intercourse? How did the women talk to the men and vice versa? Well, you'd go to these dances. You'd be in a room full of people, but whilst you're dancing, you can have that private discourse because everybody else is busy with their dancing, they're busy with their social discourse, so you could have some intimacy, and it would have been electrifying just to feel the lingering touch of another's fingers, just to talk in hushed tones. And there was a socially accepted 2-dance limit. A man wasn't supposed to dance with the same woman more than twice in a single night, unless, of course, he was intending to propose to her. If you did that, then everyone would be aghast, shocked, gossiping. Oh, there must be something about to happen with those two. So it would have been shockingly profligate to dance a lot with Tom Lefroy and to sit down. And these little conversations for a very young Austen must have been electrifying. People will read these books and today through the modern lens, because we're inundated with the endlessly explicit, people will think these books are dry and devoid of sexuality. Sex absolutely steams off the pages of Jane Austen's novels. And so it looked for a time that these two, Tom and Jane, would be the perfect match for marriage, but Tom's family were not happy about the Austen family's finances and their inability to provide a dowry of any substance. And thus, what did they do? They poured water over the coals of that one, and they stopped that. They made sure that wasn't going to happen. We see Jane writes another letter to her sister, aware that the relationship is about to be severed before it can really start to flourish and grow, not long after their first dances, and she says, with great pathos and humour and self-deprecation, the kind of self-deprecation and irony that would mark her novels, she says, "At length the day is come on which I am to flirt my last with Tom Lefroy. And when you receive this, it will be over. My tears flow as I write at the melancholy idea." So she is sad, she's using humour and a little bit of hyperbole to get through it. Tom would go on to marry another woman, and he would be a successful lawyer and would become Lord Chief Justice of Ireland, and he would have a family, whilst Austen would go on to channel that love and loss into her novels, and she would refer to her novels as her children. And that's a very fitting metaphor if we consider the fact that she basically gave birth to the psychological and social novel as we know it today. Not too long after this, something else left a very strong impression upon young Jane. Her older sister Cassandra had been engaged to a man called Thomas Fowle, who contracted yellow fever whilst on military expedition in the West Indies in an attempt to increase his fortune so that he could marry her. It was very typical for women to be on the younger side when it came to marriage, early 20s, mid-20s, but often they would have an older husband in his 30s or mid-30s onwards, because a man had to rise up in the world before he was a worthy prospect himself. He either had to wait for an inheritance or he had to go out, join the military or do something to earn the money that he would use to support his family. Sadly, the love of Cassandra's life died, and Jane was affected by the depth of grief she saw in her sister. She felt her pain. They were very, very close. So her grief became Jane's grief, but she also admired the equanimity with which Cassandra held herself in the face of this tragedy. She also noted that her sister never married. After this, she vowed never to marry again. She remained unmarried her entire life until death. Now, there is another romantic figure in Jane's life that we know basically nothing about. This is a real mystery. But supposedly, Jane had something of a romance or a burgeoning romance and some courtship with a mysterious unnamed gentleman whilst the family was holidaying in Devon in the early 1800s. A name has been put forth, but we actually don't really know anything about this man other than the fact that one of Jane's nieces claimed she became acquainted with a very charming man whilst they were at the seaside, a man who was charming in mind and person, and indeed her sister Cassandra thought him so charming that he was sure to win her sister's love. When they parted from this gentleman, he expressed his intention of seeing them, and Jane specifically, soon again, but within a very short time period after that, they would hear of his sudden and untimely death. It is theorised that if Jane ever truly had real love, it was for this unnamed gentleman. And the thing is, whilst the unfair old maid stereotype was running rampant in Georgian society, if a woman reached her 30s and was still single, she was considered an old maid. It's actually a common misconception that Jane and Cassandra remaining unmarried was anything wildly outside the norm of society. As Rory Moore points out in his recent book, Love and Marriage in the Age of Jane Austen, practically a third of women would have fallen into this category. And although we can see Austen as basically engineering the idea of marrying for love, realistically, this was something that was taking place in the culture. So Austen, like all great writers do, was not only influencing the culture, but she was also a channel for the cultural change at the time, because indeed just before she was writing, we do see increasingly more and more stories were showing the importance of marrying for love, and they were emphasising this as being a great societal good. You start to see this in plays and novels and stuff like that, and increasingly more and more women were deciding to marry for love, or at least its potential, or not marry at all. That was the choice that many were deciding to make. And at this point in the culture, marriages were no longer forced, for the most part anyway. But there was still a tension. This was a transitional period. You could marry for love or not marry because you didn't love, but often when you did marry, the prime thing to take into consideration was your class. And again, if you want to know about the Georgian class system, then please check out my Pride and Prejudice video in which I break that down. But essentially, when it came to the class system of the UK at the time, it wasn't just working class, middle class and upper class, but there were rungs within those classes, and there were rungs within the middle class. Very confusing and multiple rungs, and indeed Jane Austen was within the middle class, but saying that doesn't tell you very much, because there was a wide variation in your social station within that one class. There were subclasses, if you like. And if your potential prospect didn't have the class or the finances or both of your subclass, then it probably wasn't going to happen. The paradox of marriage at the time was marrying was the means of a woman securing financial security and also securing her social class, but simultaneously and paradoxically, she also had no legal or financial rights of her own. The trajectory for women at the time was to go from their father to their husband. And so the women of a family would treat the finding of a partner as a career unto itself. If you didn't marry as a woman, you'd end up dependent on the goodwill of brothers or male relatives. But the thing is, because you have that paradox where, yes, you secure your financial stability, but you actually don't have your own financial rights or legal rights in that regard. You have the law of coverture, in which the woman is subsumed by the man, and indeed women are being defined by their relation to, or lack of relation to, a man. Man and woman merge as one, but it's not a fair or equal union. That merging is actually a subsuming of the man over the woman. Because that's the case, it was so important to pick the right partner. And this was a much more important question than it is today, or than it's taken by many today. The thing is, you didn't have the luxury of marrying the wrong person, because that could well be the difference between being content for the rest of your life, or being trapped in a very tragic situation. What's interesting about Austen's heroines is that they manage to have it all in the end. They not only marry for love and attraction, but pragmatically they get their perfect match, class and wealth-wise too. So her novels are a kind of wish-fulfilment fantasy for readers who may or may not find themselves so lucky. So many, like Charlotte Lucas from Pride and Prejudice, were making the decision to marry out of pragmatism, but more and more, like Jane and Cassandra, were choosing not to marry because they couldn't marry the one they loved. And this is more emphasised when you actually do love someone and lose them. We also might consider that Jane herself did receive a proposal of marriage in the winter of 1802. A family friend called Harris Big Wither, a man who was 6 years her junior, he was 21 and she was nearing in on 27, he proposed to her whilst they were on holiday. Now, Jane said yes when he asked, perhaps fearing the mortification of denying him right off the bat. But then she spent a torturous night in which she had to weigh up the financial security and social respectability that he and his family would offer. She had to weigh that up against the fact, the undeniable fact, that she didn't love him and she didn't think she could love him. And so, regretting her affirmative answer, she withdrew her acceptance the very next morning, thus rejecting financial security that the family desperately needed. And they returned home, and it must have been a frosty ride home. So let's take a little look at the love story at the heart of Emma, and let's see what Austen herself most likely desired from a romantic union. And via this we might consider what we most desire from our partner and how we might get that via how we conduct ourselves. Let's talk about the story, but in talking about the story of Emma, there are a couple of difficulties. One, many critics of the work have historically said that there isn't much of a story at all. But ironically, lovers of the story say quite the opposite and are keen to emphasise that first-time readers don't know too much going in. And that's because there is mystery at the heart of this story. So much so that novelist P.D. James has called Emma a great detective story and claims it to be the first of that genre. And this is something that we'll be talking about in depth with our Christmas read, our festive read. We're going to be reading Charles Dickens's Bleak House at the Hardcore Literature Book Club. As I said in the recent reveal video for that novel, the fifth Dickens novel, or sixth Dickens story we've read together, we can chart a lineage of detectives through literature, from Edgar Allan Poe's Auguste Dupin through to Inspector Bucket and on to Sherlock Holmes, and then into the 20th century with the characters of Agatha Christie and then the hard-boiled characters of Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler. But it would be very interesting to consider Emma as a strange precursor to all of that. But P.D. James points out that the secret of the novel, which is the mainspring of its action, is in the unrecognised relationships between the limited number of characters. This story, James says, closely confined to a closed society in a rural setting, which is typical of many works of detective fiction after, is filled with many carefully constructed clues through action, ostensibly innocuous conversation, and Jane's authorial voice. And these are clues pointing to the secret we are being deceived about. So there's that. And there's also the fact, of course, that when it comes to a comedy of manners like Emma, structurally, we already know how it's going to end. We know how a comedy ends. When we talk of comedy or tragedy, these are structural terms. A tragedy is a tragedy because it ends in death, with a stage or page or wash with blood. A comedy is a comedy because it ends in marriage. And we know that the heroine is going to be married at the end of the story, unless we get a really subversive and experimental work like, say, Love's Labour's Lost by William Shakespeare, and we have a lecture on that fireworks display of a play at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, if you're interested. So we don't read to find out what happens at the end, although, as I said, there is a mystery at the heart of this one. Because we know generally the direction it's trending towards, we don't read primarily for that, but the excitement in reading these stories is in how we get there, and Austen certainly knows how to subvert our expectations in the telling of the tale. And so I will be confining myself now to the opening setup of the story alone, some of the themes, and allowing you to then pick up the novel and start meeting the cast from there. And again, if you want my commentary, analysis and appreciation for the entire book, then at time of recording we will be having lectures for this novel on the weekends across November. So, Jane Austen takes us into the heart of Highbury, her fictional Surrey village. With great irony, she describes Highbury as a large and populous village, almost amounting to a town. Highbury is situated 16 miles away from London, and we're taken into the Hartfield estate of the Woodhouse family, and also the surrounding estates of Randalls and Donwell Abbey too. Such is Austen's power to craft a compelling atmosphere and a vivid sense of place that many have seen Highbury as a character in its own right. A character as vivid and compelling as Emma herself. Of course, we've spoken much in the Hardcore Literature Book Club about how locale can become character. We spoke about this very recently with Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca. And what's interesting is Emma is the novel in which Jane Austen uses the technique of free indirect discourse most intensely. What's free indirect discourse or style? That's when the voice of the characters inflect the narrative. So you have third-person omniscient narration, where the author is God in the universe, looking down on everything, able to see everything, but certain lines told to us in that third person are peculiarly biased, or they have the curious tone or viewpoint via a choice word or a specific phrase of certain individuals. So you can see things from a character's point of view and outside of their point of view simultaneously. You've got a really comprehensive view of everything, and we zoom in and out of different characters' interiorities. We'll get into this in depth in the Hardcore Literature Book Club, but here's a quick example of this free indirect style from Emma. The rest of the day, the following night, were hardly enough for her thoughts. She was bewildered amidst the confusion of all that had rushed on her within the last few hours. Every moment had brought a fresh surprise, and every surprise must be matter of humiliation to her. How to understand it all? How to understand the deceptions she had been thus practicing on herself and living under, the blunders, the blindness of her own head and heart? She sat still, she walked about, she tried her own room, she tried the shrubbery. In every place, every posture, she perceived that she had acted most weakly. It's third person, and yet this is heavily inflected by Emma's own thoughts. In fact, we get what we assume to be a direct thought, but not presented directly. Not in quote marks or anything like that. How to understand it all? That's Emma's own thought. And then there's comedy too, the humiliation, the sense of mortification. That's just one example, but there are many more than that. Essentially, free indirect style is an extraordinarily sophisticated technique that we take for granted today, thanks to Austen. Her genius has disseminated so widely, her influence is so ubiquitous that we cannot even apprehend it. We take her for granted just as we do Shakespeare, but what she was doing was absolutely revolutionary. And we see the greatest heirs of her technique across the course of the 19th century would be Gustave Flaubert and Henry James. But before Austen, no one did this as significantly or relentlessly or purposefully as she did. She systematised this. But Emma is the novel that is most intense with free indirect style. Now, Robert Irvine would say that there are three voices in Emma. You've got the voice of Highbury itself, the setting. You've got the narrator's voice. That's the voice of Jane. And Jane has an ironic, wry tone, and she's very wise. And then, of course, you have the voice of Emma. And we get overwhelming amounts of her interiority. Now, the novel that had the most instances of free indirect style is Pride and Prejudice. Critics have identified at least 19 different voices inflecting that narrative. The narrative is filtered through 19 different viewpoints at least. Whereas Mansfield Park has the greatest subtlety of free indirect style, and perhaps Persuasion is the novel that has the most mature and rich development of it, and the kinds of voices that we find fused in the narrative in Persuasion are more varied. And so you can see with just one incredible technique how it completely changes the tone and feel of a story. A story isn't just about what happens and who it happens to, but it's how it is told. And so when you've got such a kaleidoscope of different perspectives in a novel like Pride and Prejudice, there's a real sparkling quality to it, and you feel like the book's moving at a fair trot. Whereas Emma doesn't run along as swiftly as a book like Pride and Prejudice. It takes its time a little bit more, and because we get Emma's voice overwhelmingly, this book is a psychological case study masquerading as a light comedy of manners. This technique is genius because it is asking us to understand these characters, and in so doing we can better understand the real people in our lives. We're trying to understand them inside and out. And indeed, if one cannot forgive Emma the flaws of immaturity, how will one ever be able to abide one's own behaviour or the behaviour of those who you love, no matter what? Because of course we all have people in our lives that we love deeply and enduringly, but they annoy us. So, Emma Woodhouse. She is the only heroine of Jane Austen's novels who gives her name to the title. And again, if you've read books like Madame Bovary and Rebecca and David Copperfield with the Hardcore Literature Book Club, you'll know just how much commentary a writer can make in choosing a name as their title. Emma Woodhouse is 21 years old, and she is absolutely spoiled rotten, and she is overly indulged by her widower father, Mr Woodhouse. And if you've read other Austen novels and you want a parallel for what Mr Woodhouse is like, you might imagine a Mrs Bennett in male form if she were totally averse to marriage. Mr Woodhouse has severe health anxieties, and he's desperate to keep the people in his life, his loved ones, firmly in his life. He wants them to stick around. Now, this is funny on the surface, but there's trauma there. He lost his wife, so of course he's developed something of a complex, and he wants people to be around him all the time. He hates losing people, and so he's very controlling about what people eat and what people do, and very overly reliant on what his doctor tells him. And we get the sense that his doctor is just mollifying him and placating him and humouring him. Now, we learn that Mr Woodhouse has already lost his other daughter, Isabella. She's married to a gentleman lawyer, and they have 5 children together. And it hurts him profoundly that he now sees very little of her. And when we open the novel, we learn that Emma, the handsome, clever, rich Emma Woodhouse, and her father are now facing the loss of their governess of 16 years. Not only their governess, but their dear friend, Miss Taylor. They're facing her loss because she has gotten married, and that means moving away. The only real financial recourse that women of the gentry had in this time was to become a governess. And so we've got this idea of loss everywhere in this book, and we've got the motif of distance absolutely everywhere too. Hartfield is our home, in the heart of the field, and we might say that home is where the heart is. And indeed, because we are the centre of our own universe, we're the main character in the story of our lives, where another is where they're living their lives, someone that you love, a sibling or a friend, where they are now is always in relation to where you are. This is a really striking way of physically representing the idea that we struggle to see outside of our own perspective. And so Highbury is all the world, even though it's quite an insular, parochial, claustrophobic little locale. It's all the world. But we see from the start that marriage is being framed as a loss. Marriage means someone is being taken away from you. And indeed, of course, they will be, to some degree, because they're going from one home to another. They have a new home that becomes their home. So we're constantly told in this novel how far this person is, how far away that person is. We're told the physical distance, and we have the horizontal plane mapped out for us, but we also have a more abstract notion of motion vertically. So we have the horizontal plane, and we also have the plane going up and down. That is the plane for social mobility. But we may say we're prompted to think most intensely about inner mobility, the movement of the inner, and metaphysical more than the physical, because of course this is a story about growth. And we have that iconic opening where we're told Emma Woodhouse is handsome and clever and rich and comfortable and united all the best blessings of existence. But we have a very curious word from the offset. She seemed to unite some of the best blessings of existence and lived with very little to vex or distress her. That seemed does a lot of heavy lifting. It tells us from the outset that things may not be as they seem. The Shakespearean plays running below the surface of this one are A Midsummer Night's Dream and As You Like It, and There's Much Ado About Nothing in there. But Shakespeare constantly tells us, as he does in The Merchant of Venice, that all that glitters is not gold. He constantly challenges us to see truly. We're going to get that in Austen too. We're told right away what to expect from this character. We're told that Emma was the youngest of the two daughters of a most affectionate, indulgent father, and had, in consequence of her sister's marriage, been mistress of his house from a very early period. Her mother had died too long ago for her to have more than an indistinct remembrance of her caresses, and her place had been supplied by an excellent woman as governess who had fallen little short of a mother in affection. So Miss Taylor, she's a friend, she's a governess, but she's also a maternal figure. And we're told that the mildness of Miss Taylor's temper had hardly allowed her to impose any restraint. And the shadow of authority being now long passed away, Emma and her had been living together as friend and friend, very mutually attached, and Emma doing just what she liked, highly esteeming Miss Taylor's judgment, but directed chiefly by her own. So she's indulged by everybody, she's the mistress of her house, she does what she likes, she's the authority, she always gets her own way. The real evils, indeed, we're told, that's quite a word, the real evils of Emma's situation were the power of having rather too much her own way, and a disposition to think a little too well of herself. These were the disadvantages which threatened alloy to her many enjoyments. The danger, however, was at present so unperceived that they did not by any means rank as misfortunes with her. So, she gets her own way too much, she's an egotist, that's the real evil, she's selfish and solipsistic and self-concerned, as we probably all are when we're young. She's a young girl, but she doesn't realise it yet. All of this is unperceived. Again, I know readers pick up this book and they feel an aversion to Emma Woodhouse. You're supposed to at first. And wouldn't literature be rather dull indeed if we only read about characters who were perfect right from the start to the end? The greatest works of fiction give us characters that must move from a state of ignorance to experience, from blindness to being able to see, some enlightenment about their own situation. This is a comedy of manners and a hilarious romance, but it's also a coming-of-age story too. From the outset, we see Emma talking with her overly indulgent father about the loss of Miss Taylor. Matrimony as the origin of change was always disagreeable to Mr Woodhouse. And we get this really incredible line. And from his habits of gentle selfishness and of being never able to suppose that other people could feel differently from himself, he was very much disposed to think Miss Taylor had done as sad a thing for herself as for them, and would have been a great deal happier if she had spent all the rest of her life at Hartfield. So the sentences are complex, they're rather labyrinthine, and there's some complicated language going on, and they contain difficult thoughts to wrangle with, psychological and social thoughts, but it's worth bringing your concentration to Austen because how powerful of an insight is that? How many people do we know like that? Indeed, have we or are we ever like that? He's so sad about the loss of Miss Taylor that he thinks that her marrying must be really distressing to her too. He cannot understand the idea that she might be happy because as consequence of her marriage, he's unhappy. Austen packs so much into her sentences. Her genius is compressed, and she really is the greatest creator of characters since Shakespeare. I agree with Thomas Babington Macaulay, who called Austen prose Shakespeare. It's very, very true. So when our loved ones move away and start their own family, they're out of necessity going to have less time for us. They're going to be removed from us, and it's okay for us to be sad about that. But it's quite a level of solipsism that's very, very common to assume that they must be equally sad, when indeed the virtue, the blessing of reading these great books is to understand how others feel, understand what makes them happy and what makes them sad, and it's not the same as what moves us all of the time. It's very, very funny because indeed she's been there, Miss Taylor, for 16 years already. The prospect of her staying there all the days of her life, for the rest of her life, the prospect of that making her happy, we don't know her too well at this point, but we can assume, well, probably not. So this book is all about learning to see not always through your own, but through another's eyes. And it is Emma who really needs to learn this more than anyone else. We see that she has an inability to see beyond her personal wishes. She doesn't see what is, she sees what she wishes or would like to be. And so we find that she's constantly getting things wrong over the course of the story. Poor Miss Taylor, Mr Woodhouse says, I wish she were here again. What a pity it is that Mr Weston ever thought of her. And Emma tutors her father kindly, and she talks him through his blindness to another's wishes. And this is a great irony because, of course, we see that Emma might be good at dispensing wisdom, but it's misapplied and she can't take her own advice. She tells others how they should live and feel, but she should probably concentrate on her own affairs. She says to her dad, I cannot agree with you, Papa. You know I cannot. Mr Weston is such a good-humoured, pleasant, excellent man that he thoroughly deserves a good wife. And you would not have had Miss Taylor live with us forever and bear all my odd humours when she might have a house of her own. A house of her own, Mr Woodhouse says. But where's the advantage of a house of her own? This is 3 times as large, and you have never had any odd humours, my dear. So, Mr Woodhouse can't see his daughter's faults. Emma kind of can. She knows that she's got some faults, but she also kind of can't at the same time, which is very, very relatable. Now, we have all of this taken up a notch in the first chapter when we learn that one of Emma's core key defining traits is that she is a matchmaker. Now, it doesn't take long reading the book before we say, well, the word meddler might be a better description. She's a matchmaker. We see this when she decides to take a younger girl called Harriet under her wing and to be her project to improve her by coordinating her marital prospects. So Harriet becomes her young protégée, and she attempts to match Harriet out of her class. So in Emma's own mind, she's an expert at orchestrating and coordinating the courtships of other people. But we stress, in her mind. And her father thinks she's an expert too. So much so that he is very, very unhappy about it. But someone who doesn't buy into all of this is Mr. George Knightley. Knightley is brother to Sister Isabella's husband, and Mr. Knightley was 16 years old when Emma was born, and now that she's 21, he is 37. So Mr. Knightley is a long-enduring fixture of the family. She's grown up with him, and we see very, very swiftly that he's the one person in her life to call her out on her immature nonsense. Mr. Knightley loves to find fault with me in a joke, Emma says. It's all a joke. We always say what we like to one another. And we're told in the first chapter that Mr. Knightley, in fact, was one of the few people who could see faults in Emma Woodhouse, and the only one who ever told her of them. This, of course, is distressing to her father. He cannot bear the idea of her not being thought perfect by everybody. Notice how sparkling the dialogue is between Emma and Mr. Knightley, and notice as you read Austen that everybody in her universe has their own distinct and recognisable way of talking, and that's not the case for all books. Only a relatively few rare writers have the power to write a line of dialogue and make you know immediately who the character is who's talking without being told. Shakespeare can do that, and Austen can do that, and it's through these writers that we see the rise of the sovereign thinking individual in English literature. Emma, gloating about how she made the match between Miss Taylor and Mr. Weston herself 4 years ago, and as she says this, Mr. Knightley shook his head at her, but her father fondly replied, "Ah, my dear, I wish you would not make matches and foretell things, for whatever you say always comes to pass. Pray, do not make any more matches. I promise you to make none for myself, papa, but I must indeed for other people. It is the greatest amusement in the world, and after such success, you know." Everybody said that Mr. Weston would never marry again. Oh dear no, Mr. Weston, who had been a widower so long. But I changed all that. I made up my mind on the subject. I planned the match 4 years ago, and when such success has blessed me in this instance, dear papa, you cannot think that I shall leave off matchmaking. Here, matchmaking is a game. It's a game to Emma. She's the centre of the universe. She writes the story of everybody around her. But this is where it gets really, really good, because then Mr. Knightley says, "I do not understand what you mean by success. Success supposes endeavour. Your time has been properly and delicately spent if you have been endeavouring for the last 4 years to bring about this marriage, a worthy employment for a young lady's mind. But if, which I rather imagine, your making the match, as you call it, means only saying to yourself one idle day, I think it would be a very good thing for Miss Taylor if Mr. Weston were to marry her, and saying it again to yourself every now and then afterwards, why do you talk of success? Where is your merit? What are you proud of? You made a lucky guess, and that is all that can be said." I love that. Of course, Emma always has an answer ready for Mr. Knightley. And have you never known the pleasure and triumph of a lucky guess? I pity you. I thought you cleverer. For depend upon it, a lucky guess is never merely luck. There's always some talent in it. She talks about how wonderfully she promoted the courtship of these two people, and her father, Mr. Woodhouse, says Emma never thinks of herself if she can do good to others. "But my dear, pray, do not make any more matches. They are silly things and break up one's family circle grievously." "Only one more, papa," she says. "One more." I absolutely adore this opening exchange, and it really sets the stage for their relationship. There are so many more instances of great dialogue between these two. I could read aloud from this book all day, but we'll dive into that more in depth in the Hardcore Literature Book Club. But what's interesting is throughout the story, whenever Emma makes a blunder, or when she says something cocky, something arrogant, something just flat out incorrect and annoying, or whenever she's mean to somebody, because she is frequently rather mean, you should immediately expect a very long chapter stuffed with dialogue in which Mr. Knightley has all the time in the world to take her to task and to chip away at some of her childish arrogance. And Knightley will very happily, or unhappily, storm into a room, pull up a chair and sit down and make sure they get into it. He is constantly holding her to account, and the wonderful thing is, Emma has all the time in the world to argue back. And hilariously, and annoyingly, she can't have it that he's right. Now, of course, what do we know about courtship in youth? Why do girls give boys a shove? Or why does the boy pull the girl's pigtails? Why does he tease a certain girl? It's because he fancies her or she fancies him. And today in England, people will talk about wanting a partner they can banter with. What they mean is they want someone they can be honest with and someone that they can call out on their nonsense and be called out in turn. So much of our day-to-day society is phatic, it's surface, it's civilised, it's adhering to nonsense, and we talk nonsense all the time. Everybody seems to talk nonsense. What's your partner supposed to do? They're supposed to get through all that. They're supposed to be the one person who doesn't talk nonsense. And we want a partner who we can rib mercilessly. Well, some people do, in fact, not everybody. Some people want someone that they can tease. It's called flirting. We see this marvellously where Emma and Mr Knightley have had a falling out, a disagreement about matters of matrimony when it comes to Harriet and who she's best matched with class-wise. And Emma wants to patch things up. She wants to be friends again with Knightley, but she also cannot bear to have it that he be right about anything or for her to be wrong. They're hanging out with their common nieces and nephews via her sister and his brother. She's playing with these young children and we're told she hoped they might now become friends again. She thought it was time to make up. Making up indeed would not do. She certainly had not been in the wrong, and he would never own that he had. Notice the free indirect style. That's Emma's thoughts coming through in omniscient form. Concession must be out of the question, but it was time to appear to forget that they had ever quarrelled. Is that relatable? Do you find that relatable? And she hoped it might rather assist the restoration of friendship that when he came into the room she had one of the children with her, the youngest, a nice little girl about 8 months old who was now making her first visit to Hartfield and very happy to be danced about in her aunt's arms. It did assist, for though he began with grave looks and short questions, he was soon led on to talk of them all in the usual way and to take the child out of her arms with all the unceremoniousness of perfect amity. Emma felt that they were friends again, and the conviction, giving her at first great satisfaction and then a little sauciness, she could not help saying, as he was admiring the baby, what a comfort it is that we think alike about our nephews and nieces. As to men and women, our opinions are sometimes very different, but with regard to these children, I observe we never disagree. So she doesn't really want to make it up. She doesn't want to restore the friendship. She wants to argue with him again, because she likes him. But she wants to argue, so she can't let it go. Just when it feels like they're back and they're friends and they've let it go, she has to say something. She has to prod him. What does he say? If you were as much guided by nature in your estimate of men and women, and as little under the power of fancy and whim in your dealings with them, as you are where these children are concerned, we might always think alike. To which she responds, to be sure, our discordancies must always arise from my being in the wrong. Again, you cannot read Austen's statements at face value. Everyone is being deeply ironic. You're right, we disagree because I'm always in the wrong. She's not actually saying that. Yes, said he, smiling, and reason good. I was 16 years old when you were born. A material difference then, she replied, and no doubt you were much my superior in judgment at that period of our lives, but does not the lapse of 21 years bring our understandings a good deal nearer? And she says, well, of course you were more mature and worldly and experienced and wise than me. I was a baby, but 21 years have passed. Come on, we're about the same now. Yes, a good deal nearer. Notice the motif of distance, by the way. We might think of holding someone at arm's length or bringing someone closer to our heart, letting somebody in. It's all distance metaphors. Yes, a good deal nearer. So there's subtext. What he's saying is, no, I'm more mature than you. I'm wiser than you. He said no whilst saying yes. It's irony. But still, Emma says, not near enough to give me a chance of being right. If we think differently, I still have the advantage of you, he says, by 16 years' experience and by not being a pretty young woman and a spoiled child. Come, my dear Emma, let us be friends and say no more about it. So he reminds her I'm 37, you're 21. You're not smarter than me. And then he turns to the girl in her arms, who is named after Emma, after her aunt. Tell your aunt, little Emma, that she ought to set you a better example than to be renewing old grievances, and that if she were not wrong before, she is now. That's true, Emma cried, very true. Little Emma, grow up a better woman than your aunt, be infinitely cleverer and not half so conceited. Now, Mr. Knightley, a word or two more and I have done. As far as good intentions went, we were both right. That's a really bratty way of going, let's agree to disagree. Our intentions were both right. And I must say that no effects on my side of the argument have yet proved wrong. Their relationship's really, really interesting. It's like a brotherly relationship, and it's a friendship first and foremost. It's very familiar. He's basically very much a family member. He knows her very well. And so Austen in this novel is framing romance as friendship, which I love. Ultimately, the greatest buddy stories are love stories at their core. We might think of the endlessly influential Don Quixote and the knight-errant and his faithful squire. They love each other. So they're good friends, but they love each other. Not in a sexual or romantic way, but they have a lot of love for one another. Ultimately, it's the same sort of love. It's a friendship that the very best relationships, the very best marriages will have too. And I think if buddy stories are ultimately love stories, then love stories are stories of friendship. Austen presents an Aristotelian view of friendship and the highest form of love. There's an intersection, it's the same. What does Aristotle say about the best kind of friendship? It's when you want the best for another as though they were yourself. And that means you know their flaws and you still love them despite their flaws, but you also know what they are capable of, and you do not want them to say or do things that are beneath them or their character. You want to bring out the best in them. And Mr. Knightley sees Emma for who she is, and he has a very brotherly, protective love over her. And he knows that the best thing for this, let's be honest, spoiled brat, is not to be indulged more than she's already being. So here we have romantic interest and partner as older and more mature and as moral guide. Although, of course, we do see he has some things he needs to learn too. A lot of love stories today take the formula best expressed by Jack Nicholson's character in the film As Good As It Gets, when he says, "You make me want to be a better man." That's his way of saying I love you. You make me want to be a better man. Now, that's a more palatable love story for many of us. The man needs to grow and learn. And perhaps one reason why readers find this book to be uncomfortable is that it's not about the man learning to overcome his issues primarily and learning to grow up and be better for the woman. In this book, the one who needs to grow up is the woman. It's the central protagonist, the heroine. But man or woman, readers would do well to summon the courage to see where they themselves have been like Emma in the past. We've all been young, we've all had that arrogance of youth. The Dunning-Kruger effect is on display most significantly when you have a 21-year-old talking to a 37-year-old. We've all been immature and we've all thought that we know everything. And we've all been less nice than we think we are. There are scenes where Emma gets very catty and passive-aggressive with people who don't deserve it, and she can say some pretty mean-spirited things. Now, here's the thing. We are privy to her interiority, so we know that she feels bad when she does so, but Knightley takes her to task for doing so, and we might think, oh, this Emma Woodhouse, she's awful, but hey, she might say things that we feel that we don't say. She might say things that we actually do say ourselves in our worst moments. In our worst moments, we've all said awful things that we end up regretting. And so to judge Emma harshly is a form of judging ourselves harshly. And indeed, we should take guidance from Mr. Knightley and learn to just make ourselves better. And if the relationship between these two, between Knightley and Emma, doesn't seem as sizzling as that of, say, Mr. Darcy and Lizzie Bennett, and if it feels more like a platonic brotherly friendship, then that's because around this time, and for most of her life, Austen's primary experience of male love was fraternal. But I think this couple work perfectly as a union, as a romantic union, In fiction, I find they might even be more relatable than Mr Darcy and Lizzie, because indeed you need friendship for a marriage to work or to be happy in your marriage. You don't want to do a Mr Bennett and marry for looks. It's the bond of friendship that endures across time. And on marriage, we get a lot of anti-marriage discourse from Emma Woodhouse, which is ironic because she's playing matchmaker relentlessly. So if she's so averse to marriage for herself, then surely she's not doing a service for everyone around her when she's partnering them off, unless of course she's not being honest with herself. She says she won't marry. When Harriet says, "I do so wonder, Miss Woodhouse, that you should not be married, or going to be married, so charming as you are," Emma laughed and replied, "My being charming, Harriet, is not quite enough to induce me to marry. I must find other people charming, one other person at least. And I am not only not going to be married at present, but have very little intention of ever marrying at all." "Ah, so you say, but I cannot believe it. I must see somebody very superior to anyone I have seen yet to be tempted." So that's interesting. I think, again, we can all relate to that. We all have high standards, or should have high standards. We all want someone, the one that we're going to throw our hat in with, the one we're going to hitch to. We want them to be the best. And that means there's got to be some superiority. But of course, Emma has a superiority complex. So who can be better than her? "If I were to marry," she says, "I must expect to repent it." Dear me, Harriet says, it is so odd to hear a woman talk so. And Emma says, "I have none of the usual inducements of women to marry. Were I to fall in love, indeed, it would be a different thing. But I have never been in love. It is not my way or my nature, and I do not think I ever shall. And without love, I am sure I should be a fool to change such a situation as mine. Fortune I do not want. Employment I do not want. Consequence I do not want. I believe few married women are half as much mistress of their husband's house as I am of Hartfield, and never, never could I expect to be so truly beloved and important, so always first and always right in any man's eyes as I am in my father's." So that's what she thinks she wants, to be right. And of course, she's going to learn that true love isn't about always being right. It's not about it. Harriet says, "But then you might be an old maid." Emma dismisses that. And she says, "Never mind, Harriet, I shall not be a poor old maid. It is poverty only which makes celibacy contemptible to a generous public. A single woman with a very narrow income must be a ridiculous, disagreeable old maid. But a single woman of good fortune is always respectable, and may be as sensible and pleasant as anybody else." Harriet says, "Well, how will you occupy your time as a single woman?" "If I know myself, Harriet, mine is an active, busy mind with a great many independent resources. I shall be very well off. I'll be happy with my sister's children. That will be my family and social discourse. I'm very happy by myself, thank you very much." So she's playing matchmaker with everyone else, whilst also giving voice to anti-marital sentiment. And so she's perhaps living vicariously through other people. And Austen is making a very powerful commentary on marriage for pragmatic reasons versus marriage for love. Now, Emma, we're told, has £30,000. Today's purchasing power means that she essentially has several million. So yes, she is rich. And she is assured that she'll always have the home she's currently living in. And this probably puts her spoiled nature into perspective. And if you want to see a really great capturing of her character, check out Alicia Silverstone in the very loose adaptation, the film Clueless. That's how Emma would have been perceived back in the Georgian era. It's very interesting that Emma is aware of her wealth, but she's not aware of her privilege, and she is a total snob. And yet, regardless of that, she's able to make a very powerful point on marriage generally. Emma is the only Austen character who does not need to marry in order to continue her high standard of living, her wealthy standard of living. And so to her, the idea of being an old maid is just something that will afflict the impoverished of society, and she need not worry about that. It's the arrogance of the message, how she delivers this, that often grates on readers, but Jane herself, Jane Austen, is making a powerful point. Jane found herself in a very uncomfortable liminal space societally because of the constraints placed on women of a certain class. Jane Austen was living in what was known as genteel poverty. So she was gentry, she was of the middle class, her father had been a clergyman, but they didn't have any money. So it was very possible to have class, but not the wealth. And so there was a division of society where you couldn't have the same standard of living as other people within your own class. And so it really was quite a revolutionary thing for Jane to take charge and work relentlessly to start earning her own income as a novelist, which she managed to do later on in her life over the course of the years. But it's through Emma, it's through this character that Austen is able to, with great irony, dismantle the social system and critique it, the social system of her day. She does so with great subtlety and poignance. And Emma, as a novel, may not have the aggressive and direct cry for women's liberation and emancipation that we find in revolutionary works from the likes of Mary Wollstonecraft, for example. But regardless of that, as John Mullen would say, Emma absolutely is a revolutionary novel. Mullen also argues very compellingly that Emma should belong alongside the works of Flaubert, Joyce and Woolf as one of the great experimental novels. But Emma is revolutionary in so many regards, in narrative technique, in psychological realism. As Lionel Trilling would say, the mind of Emma Woodhouse is the real subject of the story. The actions are important only as they reveal the mind and contribute to its education. It's revolutionary with its social satire. Austen puts her finger relentlessly and perceptively on the bondages of class and sex in the 19th century, and it's also revolutionary in that it makes the reader an active participant in interpreting the work and uncovering the mystery at the heart of this romance. And there is endless wisdom in this book, no matter how many times you read and reread it. Wisdom that you can take into your life. What does love really mean? What does it look like? What do we want from our partners? And what do we have to become in order to secure the kind of love that's the highest form of friendship? And in this novel, we get a truth that's very rarely acknowledged in real life, that very often real love is right before our very eyes. Real love has often been there all along. And in order to secure deep love and friendship, we must ensure that we grow. As Jane would tell her sister Cassandra in a letter, she wrote only for those who had a great deal of ingenuity in themselves. So, release your inner genius and bring yourself powerfully to Emma. And with that, I'm going to leave off today, and we are reading Jane Austen's Emma at the Hardcore Literature Book Club at patreon.com/hardcore literature, and I would love for you to join us. I love her novels with all my heart, and I want my love to be your love. These discussions are designed for two kinds of reader: the Janeite, rereaders of Austen who love her dearly, but also readers who need some encouragement coming to her works. My mission in the book club is to facilitate the peak experience of falling deeply and madly in love with the greatest writers of all time. Our lectures, as I've said, come out on the weekends. We are going to be splitting this particular work right down the middle, so we have another lecture this coming weekend, and the reading assignment for that discussion is in the post for this video at the Hardcore Literature Book Club, and our reading of Emma is going to take us through the month of November, and at the very end of November we're going to have our biggest video of the year, which is the Hardcore Literature Book Club schedule announcement, the reveal for next year's reading programme. And then after that we're going to be digging into Charles Dickens and reading Bleak House together across the course of the festive season. And we're going to be congratulating ourselves for a great reading year, and we're going to get our heads in the game for another phenomenal year of bookish adventures. But for now, I want to say a huge thank you for watching today. And have you read Emma before? If so, what do you make of it? What advice would you give someone to facilitate a meaningful experience? Do you like it? Do you dislike it? If so, why? If this is your first reading of Emma, tell me what you're looking forward to, and tell me what you make of Jane Austen generally. Thank you again for being here. I appreciate you, and I hope you have a wonderful day. Happy reading, and bye-bye for now.